Good evening and welcome to the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service Hermit's Peak and Calf Canyon Wildfire Watershed Restoration Programmatic Environmental Impact Statement Public Scoping Meeting. I am Brad Johnson with HDR, a member of the consultant team and supporting NRCS, and I'll be your host this evening. We'll take care of a few introductory items, then jump into the meeting. First, I would like to quickly walk through our agenda for tonight. It is our intent for the presentation itself to last for 20 to 30 minutes, leaving the remaining time for those with us here at Highlands University to look at the maps displayed on the wall and allow everyone time to provide feedback this evening. Let me begin by again saying welcome. We are excited that you've joined us either in person or online this evening to learn about this project. Before I run through a quick set of team introductions, we'll quickly run through a few housekeeping items for today's meeting. A few items before we get started. Please note this presentation is being recorded through Zoom. We look forward to sharing information with you about the environmental impact statement. We kindly ask that questions and comments be held until the conclusion of the presentation. We will provide information at the end of the presentation to assist with the many different ways you can provide feedback on this project. First, I would like to begin by introducing the NRCS team who are leading this project. We have Eli Ganan, the NRCS State Conservation Engineer, and Mercedes Fabach, who cannot be with us tonight, the NRCS Watershed Program Manager. As you'll also note, there are a number of other agencies involved with the project. Now I'd like to introduce the consultant team who are supporting the NRCS on this project. We have with us from RJH Consultants, Inc., Tom McDougall, who is the project manager. From AIRS Associates, we have Mary Hasenga, who is with us here this evening, who is the AIRS PM, and then Dusty Robinson, the hydrology lead. From HDR Engineering, we have Gabe Alvarado, who is the HDR project manager, myself as the technical lead, and Marissa Mays as the strategic communications lead. Before stepping into an overview of the project background, I think it makes sense for us to quickly run through the purpose of tonight's meeting. We want to introduce the project, provide everyone an overview of NEPA, and of course, solicit public feedback. We'll now begin with an overview of the project background, and to kick us off, I'm going to hand the presentation off to Eli Ganan, NRCS State Conservation Engineer, to talk first about the NRCS Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Operations Program.
All right, welcome everybody. Thanks, Brad. So yeah, we're just going to go kind of quickly through what the Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Program is, and you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So the NRCS Watershed umbrella, kind of under what we call watersheds here at NRCS, it includes the WFPO program, which this plan is under, and it also includes rehab, which looks at rehabilitating current flood control structures already built by NRCS in the past. And then it also includes EWP, which actually falls under a different program manager here with NRCS that falls under Kenneth Branch, who some of you probably know. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So under WFPO, there's different purposes that we can look at to fund a project. Through WFPO, the Hermit's Peak project fell under many purposes just because it is such a widespread project. But the 7 purposes we typically look at with WFPO are listed there, and I believe almost all of these are kind of included in the Hermit's Peak plan effort. So pretty much any of these can be looked at, and they do come with some different funding and things like that, but overall there's a lot of different possibilities we can do through WFPO. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So through WFPO, there's multiple phases or steps, we frequently call them. So we're funding these at different times. So right now we're currently in the watershed planning stage. So the preliminary investigation feasibility report was actually completed already. Some of you might have been involved in that process. That was done in-house through NRCS. And that kind of just makes sure we have a feasible project. They had a lot of these projects where we would get right into planning, and frequently we would catch large hiccups early in the planning stage. To kind of prevent that, we kind of do a desktop analysis, and that's what we call the preliminary investigation feasibility report, or PIFR. Many of you have probably heard the weird term PIFR, and that's where that comes from. So currently we're in watershed planning. And then once we're done with the plan, we can move forward and request funding for design. On this project, it's going to be kind of interesting because we don't really know exact projects we're going to be looking at. So we foresee different sponsors being able to want to fund the design phase or request funding for the design phase of different projects within this larger scope. And then finally, after design, we have construction. So you can go ahead to the next slide, I think, Brad. So every time we have a request for funding, we have a sponsor come to NRCS to request assistance, and there's various responsibilities that that sponsor has to be willing to take on. So one of the most contentious, you might be able to say, is power of eminent domain. Frequently this scares people off, but really we just request sponsors have the ability. You are never forced to use the power of eminent domain, but that one does frequently scare people off, and we try by any means necessary to avoid that. They need to have land rights easement to the area we're looking at, and that's kind of why we have DFA on board as a sponsor, because they oversee the whole state. So it was easy to bring them on a sponsor and say we kind of have that ability with DFA on board. They have to have the ability to go out and get permits and licenses, authority to levy taxes, and really the big one with that is NRCS wants to make sure these projects will be taken care of in the future. So that authority to levy taxes goes back to the ability to pay for O&M and keep things in operating condition. So it doesn't necessarily sometimes have to be the authority to levy taxes, but there has to be that ability to pay for O&M into the future. And that kind of leads into the second one. And then watershed management, easement regulations, and you have to agree to land treatments above reservoirs. So if we looked at possibly doing a flood control dam or something like that, the sponsor has to be able to take on some land treatment possibilities above that reservoir. I think you can go ahead to the next slide, Brad.
Thank you, Eli. And as a note, you can utilize the QR code you see on your screen to access additional information about the project. Great. Now we'd like to give everyone with us tonight a sense of the work that is being accomplished to prepare for the upcoming environmental review process and the preparation of the environmental impact statement. I feel confident in saying that it seems likely that most everyone has seen a map or picture of the fire footprint for the Hermit's Peak and Calf Canyon wildfires. What we have on the screen now are a pair of maps prepared by AIRS that show the fire footprint in two different and related ways. The map on the left shows the elevation gradients for the lands within the fire footprint and show the watersheds at a fairly high level. On the right-hand side is a second map that shows the burns of severity within the fire footprint from low to high severity and includes unburned areas as well. These maps are drawn from the work that is being prepared by AIRS, a member of the consultant team, and will help inform our understanding of existing conditions of the project area. I wanted to share these as a way of setting the stage for our discussion of the project. Now we'll spend a bit of time talking about the NEPA process and the environmental impact statement for post-wildfire restoration. Here we have the project timeline, but you'll notice that it actually begins in the summer of 2022. with the preparation of a handful of post-wildfire reports. Those are important data points in the project timeline leading up to the onboarding of the consultant team in September of last year. Right now, we are in the project scoping with anticipation of beginning alternatives development later this spring, followed by the analysis of impacts initiating this summer, with a record of decision anticipated in Q3 of 2026. We'll talk a little bit more about these different items in the coming slides. I'd like to direct your attention to the bottom slide where there are a pair of bullets related to parallel efforts. We are aware that other federal agencies are either conducting or have completed NEPA analyses related to the Hermit's Peak and Calf Canyon wildfires. We'll certainly recognize those efforts within the programmatic EIS, where we are preparing to avoid duplication of effort to the extent possible. So what is NEPA? NEPA is shorthand for the National Environmental Policy Act. In the legislation, the U.S. Congress directed federal agencies to do a handful of things when it came to the federal government taking major actions. You will see these in the blue column on the screen and consist of assessing the impacts associated with proposed activities, analyzing impacts to alternatives, disclosing impacts to the public, and providing opportunities for public review and input, which are what bring us here this evening. Now, more specifically to our meeting this evening, how does this process take place? First, the agency begins gathering the relevant information related to the project. As the project itself begins to come into better focus, the agency announces the project and asks for public input. That is in part what brings us together this evening. Next, different alternatives to address the problem are developed. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the coming slide. Then the real work begins. The agency must prepare an analysis of the environmental impacts related to the project. This is the heart of the EIS. Once that is done, those impacts must be disclosed to the public, which is what you see in the main bullet 3, in the blue column. The agency again asks for feedback on the project, and the analysis then makes any necessary changes based on that feedback. Once the EIS is finalized, a record of decision, or ROD for short, will serve as the decision-making document for the project and will be based on the EIS. In a nutshell, that is what the process will look like for the Hermit's Peak and Calf Canyon wildfire restoration NEPA process. There is quite a lot of work that goes into this. To provide you a sense of what work has already begun, on the screen are a number of resource areas and issues that have been identified as potentially being impacted as a result of addressing post-wildfire impacts within the burn scar and downstream. This is not an all-inclusive list, and this is also an area where feedback from people who live and work in the area and the region can help us better understand what we need to be looking at with regard to potential impacts. We certainly welcome any feedback you have on topics that should be analyzed in the EIS. As I mentioned a few slides back, as we move farther into the NEPA process, we need to develop alternatives that will meet the needs of addressing the impacts associated with the wildfires. When alternatives are developed for a NEPA document, there's always a no-action alternative. This basically says that nothing will happen and things will continue on as they are today. You can consider this the status quo, which I imagine we can all agree does not serve anyone well. This serves as the baseline against which all of the alternatives are analyzed to understand potential impacts. As currently envisioned, we anticipate that there will be 3 action alternatives that will be composed of different activities that can be taken to lessen the impact of post-wildfire impacts and assist with restoration. Right now, we anticipate assembling different activities into bundles that are then analyzed together as alternatives. The process for developing these alternatives will begin later this spring. Once the alternatives are established, the work of producing the analysis begins. As we move toward the end of our presentation, we'll talk a little more about public scoping and timeline before drawing the presentation to a close. Before we draw the meeting to a close, I would like to quickly review for those of us here in the room today and watching online the timeline for public scoping for the Hermit's Peak and Calf Canyon wildfires. There will be a notice published in the Federal Register that officially kicks off the NEPA timeline. We don't know the exact date when that will happen, but we anticipate it will likely be in the near future. As you see under the second bullet, The public scoping period is open from March 4th until a date yet to be determined. As part of that effort is tonight's meeting. There may also be additional meetings. If in fact that turns out to be the case, they will likely be announced once the notice in the Federal Register is published, so potentially more to come on that in a later date. We've now reached the end of our presentation. There are multiple ways for you to provide your thoughts on this project. Also, I want to take a moment to point out the maps around the room, along with sticky notes that are available for folks to write their thoughts on and place them on the maps in areas where you have seen impacts or have concerns. Also, there are printed comment sheets that you can take with you if you like. The NRCS and consultant team will be here to assist with providing comments. Please let us know how we can help. On behalf of the NRCS, thank you for taking time out of your day to be with us this evening. This draws to a close our presentation. Thank you.